In my previous high ISO test with the Z9 and the D850, a number of people pointed out that I should redo that test, but shoot the images in RAW instead of JPEGs. So I set up a new test and captured RAW images. Just like in the last test, I set the camera up on a tripod and used the same lens set to the same aperture for the two cameras. Because I shot in RAW, I imported the images into Adobe Lightroom and then set the same white balance for all the images before exporting them as JPEGs for this comparison. I didn't do any noise reduction or any other adjustments. Let's compare the two images side by side. Here is the low 1 ISO, or the equivalent of ISO 32 for both cameras. Even though the white balance is the same, the water looks a bit more green for the Z9 and a bit more blue for the D850. Here are the 64 ISO examples. The low ISOs for both cameras were great. Now we have ISO 100. The long exposure times means that the water movement is blurred. And at ISO 200, you can still see a bit of color difference in the water between the two cameras. Here we are at ISO 400. We start to see some texture in the water as the shutter speeds get a bit faster. ISO 800. The digital noise in the lower half of the ISOs for both cameras looked really good. Now we get into the second half of ISOs for the two cameras with ISO 3200, ISO 6400. Now at this magnification, they actually both look pretty good. At ISO 12800, we start to see some digital noise. Here we have the highest native ISOs for both cameras. The two cameras look very similar. We will take a closer look at these two images very soon. This is high 1, which is the equivalent of ISO 51200. And this is high 2 ISO for both cameras, which has an equivalent ISO of 102,400. There is a noticeable difference from the previous ISOs with both cameras. There is a real shift in the color on the D850 towards green in the water at this ISO, and it's more saturated than previous ISOs. On the other hand, there's a real lack of contrast in the Z9, and the image is quite flat. In my previous video, we saw that capturing high ISO JPEGs, I did notice that the Z9 added a lot more smoothing than the D850 when processing the images in camera. So Alex Verbeck 2228 pointed out that shooting JPEGs wasn't really a fair comparison because each camera processes the raw information that comes into it differently. The D850's processing ability is older technology when compared to the Z9, so the best thing to do was to take the camera's conversion from raw data to JPEG out of the equation and put the raw files from both cameras into a program like Lightroom. And that way it levels out the playing field. So did shooting raw images really make a difference? Let's take a closer look at this image. We've zoomed in over 600%. Now this is ISO 64 and you can see it's very clean. And this is ISO 25,600 for the D850. I captured this image as a RAW file again and export as a JPEG, just as a reminder. You can see noticeable noise when zoomed in this amount. Let's compare it to the Z9. Now you can see that the amount of noise for both images are essentially the same. The color is a bit different, even though I set that white balance to exactly the same setting before exporting them out of Lightroom. Here we can go back and forth. There's the D850 and the Z9. So when you take the camera's ability to process the data out of the equation, the amount of noise for the Z9 and the D850 were almost identical. Let's take a look at another part of the image. I wanted to see how the two cameras handled dark black. So this is at ISO 64. It looked the same for both the Z9 and the D850. Now this is the D850 at ISO 25,600. You can definitely see the noise. And once again, the amount of noise is essentially the same as it was on the Z9. When it comes to the amount of noise, there is no discernible difference between the two images that have been captured as RAW images and then exported as JPEGs in the native ISO ranges. One thing that I wanted to take a closer look at was if the color stayed the same across the different ISO settings. So I took a slice of the image and you can see what it looks like for each camera. Remember, I shot in RAW and then set the white balance in Lightroom. I do expect the colors and the quality to get a bit messier as you get into the higher ISOs, and you can see that here. This is the D850, and when you specifically look at the water, you can see that the D850 looks more blue at the lower ISOs and then gets green in the very high ISOs. Let's compare that to the Z9. I feel like the color in the images is more consistent across all the ISOs in the Z9, but like the D850, the overall image is what I would call muddier at the high 1 and high 2 ISOs. So here you can see comparison between the two. There's the D850 and the Z9. You can see what I'm talking about there. Now let's take a closer look at a different image. Once again, raw images were captured, put into Lightroom, where I set the white balance the same for each one. So nothing else was adjusted, and then the images were exported as JPEGs. Here we have low 1. This is ISO 64. Now both cameras were really good, but they weren't identical. One of the things I found interesting is the spotlight on the green cover of the boat in the middle of the image. From a distance, the D850 seems to handle the spotlight a lot better. Now a closer look confirms that the color of the green seems a bit more flat in the Z9 when compared to the D850, but the details are actually really well retained in both cameras, and so that difference could be equalized when adjusting that raw image. So here we are at ISO 100. So with this set of images, the Z9 actually looks a bit more flat than the D850, but remember, I didn't make any adjustments to the raw files other than that white balance setting, so that difference could be easily adjusted. Here we are at ISO 200. Like my last test when I captured JPEGs, the D850 tended to underexpose compared to the Z9 by about a third to 2/3 of a stop. So for this test, I ended up using manual exposure to keep those exposure times the same. Here we are at ISO 400. ISO 800 images are nice and clean. ISO 1600. ISO 3200. We'll zoom in and take a closer look at the noise across all of the ISOs for this image. Here we are, 6400 ISO, 12,800 ISO. I can definitely see that the Z9 image is flatter. Again, easily can be adjusted. Here we have the highest native ISO of 25,600, high 1, high 2. And like the last example, the biggest difference from one ISO to the next is the jump from high 1 to high 2, especially on the D850. It's noticeably worse. See, there's high 1 and there's high 2. Back to high 1 and high 2. You can really see that. So let's take a closer look at the images. Zoom in about 500%. We already looked at the amount of noise. Now let's take a look at the quality of the digital noise across all the different ISOs. Like in my previous test, the noise is incredibly well controlled in the first half of the native ISOs for the Z9 from ISO 64 up to 1600. Now there's a low 1. I didn't really have space, so I just put it in there just for reference. As you would expect, things get very messy in the higher ISOs, but I actually think that ISO 6400 is still quite usable. Remember, I'm zoomed in over 500%. Now let's take a look at the D850. Like the Z9, the first half of ISOs looks great. And here is, for reference, ISO low 1, equivalent to ISO 32. Like the Z9, the D850 gets messy at the higher ISOs, especially high 1 and high 2. ISO 3200 for the D850 looks usable, but 6400, I think it's debatable, and 12,800 would definitely need a bit of noise reduction. So I thought it might be helpful to put the high ISO images of the D850 and the Z9 images side by side to compare. So the D850 images are on the top and the Z9 images are on the bottom. I do think that the Z9 images look just a bit better, especially at ISO 12,800. It's almost like the Z9 is one step better in these examples. So for example, 12,800 on the Z9 is kind of like 6,400 on the D850. And when we look at a comparison between the three highest ISO options, again, the Z9 looks better for each one. It actually looks like the details in the image are better retained in the Z9 when compared to the D850. When I look at the details of the metal on the white part of the boat, they just seem to be better on the Z9. to my eye, it actually looks like the D850 has larger grain than the Z9. I don't know why it looks like that or what would explain this, but if you have any ideas, please let me know. So, what is my conclusion? First of all, capturing the images in RAW really made a huge difference. When you capture JPEGs, you are limited by each camera's ability to process the data, and that made the results very different. So when using high ISOs, capturing raw images will make a big difference. Another thing was that even though I set the same white balance in Lightroom for the images, there was some slight color differences between the two cameras. In addition to this, the Z9 seemed to have more consistency in color across all of the ISOs. The amount of digital noise at the higher ISOs looked to be very similar for the two cameras. Both the Z9 and the D850 were messy for high 1 and high 2 in the ISO ranges. However, a direct comparison of the images at the different ISOs showed that the quality of the digital noise seemed to be better in the Z9 than in the D850. So, I hope you found this comparison of the high ISOs of the Z9 and the D850 useful. If you like the content I'm creating, please consider subscribing. Thanks so much.